All right. Thank you so much. How you guys doing? Good. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it. It's been a number of years since I spoke in a public setting. The last time was the wild game feed at Good Shepherd Church 5-6 years ago. Shared basically kind of what I'm sharing tonight, but tonight's focus is on pollinators. So I happen to have a business that I plant wildflowers, and they go hand in hand, and we're going to get into that tonight. Like she said, I graduated from here in '98, and my family, she talked about that, but my passion is the outdoors. My passion is from the quick kind of backstory. In 10th grade, I was a runner at DC, and my times were going down. I had some pains. I went to the trainer, and he said, "You're done running competitively." And so kind of shut that door, and I was into the outdoors, but then that's all I did. From that point on, I spent, you can ask my mom here, I'd get home from school and I was off to the woods. And I never went to town except to go to church on Wednesdays and church on Sundays. Otherwise, I was in the woods. And it was my passion in life. And I ended up turning that and going to the University of Minnesota for wildlife management, and came out of that. I worked for Prairie Restorations. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They've been in business for probably 40 years now. I worked out of their Watertown office as a management coordinator on the management side of Prairie. So you have the installation side of the Prairie, and then you have the management after that. And so I was a coordinator there for a few years, and ended up doing something else for Jay Asplin when he had that store. I worked for him for 5 years, and then decided this was my passion in life, and just pulled the trigger and went with it, and couldn't afford to do it, but couldn't afford not to, because you only live one life, you know. And so anyhow, today we are going to talk about planting for pollinators. So I specialize mainly in natives, so native prairie to Minnesota, so more not so much on all the landscaping plants, landscaping flowers. Some of you in here are probably experts on those. That's not necessarily my forte. I mainly go with the natives is kind of pretty much what I work with, but we'll get into a little bit of everything. Go ahead, and there's a little bit of difficulty with this. The slides are shuffling forward fast, so she has to kind of come back. So if it's going forward and she's coming back, that's why. There's my beautiful family. My wife Abby and 6 kids: Oren, Selah, Gideon, Lander, Kaya, and Sawyer. And so we live north of the high school a few miles, next to family property, where she said I've been planting trees for, this will be 28 years this spring, that I've already got all my trees ordered. And so that's kind of where I started. Go ahead and go to the next picture. Another passion of mine, the Boundary Waters. I've done about 28 trips up to the Boundary Waters since 1992. So I like to get there every year and explore some beautiful country. Go ahead. All right, so that's this is where it started for me, planting trees. 1997, started buying and planting trees from Wright County, and been doing it ever since. And just keep plugging them in and plugging them in. And that's the family property to the back there, and the 20 I live on wasn't our property, and someone else put a big house and shed on it. And I was pretty sorely disappointed when that went up, but lo and behold, it came up for sale when I was still in college with a $11 an hour seasonal job, and my wife and I walked into a $400,000 mortgage. And then the bubble burst in '08. So anyhow, now I got some property to play with. And so then I started getting into the wildflowers and prairie. And so that's what I've been doing there. Go ahead. There's one of the trees I planted many years ago. It's quite a bit bigger than that now. Go ahead. And plant trees, and you have a place to go explore in the woods and just enjoy nature. Go ahead. So here's my house. This is a picture we'll get into a little bit later, but that's actually my septic mound, that planting where the flowers are. I planted that septic mound in '08, and that picture was probably just a couple years after that. So it doesn't look like that now. But that's what I've done at my place. That was my first getting my feet wet in '08. Go ahead. All right, so getting into pollinators. So pollinators for us, from our human perspective, equals what? Food. Without food, or without pollinators, we don't have food. Basically, your fruits, nuts, and vegetables, we're pretty much reliant on pollinators. So without pollinators, we're not eating a whole lot. Go ahead. Over 150 different food crops depend on pollinators. Without them, we have 150 food crops. That's a massive part of our agriculture is thanks to pollinators. We all love fruit. Everyone loves fruit here, I hope. Imagine life without fruit. Just imagine that wasn't part of our spectrum of what we could put on the table and what we could eat. That would be a tough one, but thanks to pollinators, we eat a lot of fruit. Apple, okay, and then go ahead. Nuts and vegetables, same thing. All the nuts and vegetables that we eat, most of them are reliant on pollinators. Next. Okay, so our primary pollinators, most of you already know this, are bees, butterflies, moths, flies, bats. I don't think in Minnesota bats are a big one, but in some parts of the world they are. Beetles, wasps, and hummingbirds. Next. Okay, 200,000 plants rely on pollinators. 200,000. It's a big deal. Next. And greater than 100,000 different animal species pollinate those plants, and most of those are insects, which is what we plant the wildflowers for. Next. Okay, so hummingbirds. So we're going to kind of go into each pollinator, and then you can kind of get a visual for what they like. So hummingbirds, when it comes to flowers, the characteristics of the flower, they like scarlet color, orange, red, and white. And they like tubular shaped, obviously with their beak. They like the tubular shaped flowers, and there's no real distinct odor on the flowers that they target. Next. And we got bees. The ones that they're most drawn to are white, yellow, and blue, but if you go out in nature, you'll see them on all the different colors. But white, yellow, and blue are the ones that you'd want to plant to target bees with a fresh, mild, or pleasant odor to the flower. Next. Moths, their flower characteristics, pale reds, purples, pinks, whites, and they have a strong, sweet odor at night. Next, bats. So they prefer dull white, green, and purple with a strong, musty odor at night. And again, I don't know in Minnesota that our bats are much for the pollinators, but in other countries we rely on cocoa, guava, mango, and banana. And I eat bananas every day, so I'm thankful for those bats. All right, next. Beetles, they prefer more the green and the white flowers, and no odor to strongly fruity or foul odor. So they kind of the whole spectrum for flowers there. Next. And then our many people's favorite, because they're so beautiful and colorful, are the butterflies. And they really target the bright reds and the purples for wildflowers, or flowers in general. And they have a faint, fresh odor. Pollinator characteristics of the insect is they're going to be highly mobile. They have hairs or scales or feather to transfer the pollen, and they have specialized mouth parts for getting the pollen as well as the nectar. Next. So when you think of pollination, what actually is it? So on a flower, you have the male parts and the female parts on a flower. And over on the right, you have the stamen that has the anther and the filament. Brings me back to botany at the U here. It's kind of a fun little refresher. So the male parts are going to be the anther, and that's going to be where the pollen grains are. And so the insect, the butterfly, the bee, beetle is going to come and go to get nectar and pick up the pollen that is on the anther. and then it goes and takes that pollen and goes to another plant to get nectar, and then that pollen grain gets established in the female part, the pistil, which is in the center there, and then you have the stigma, the style, the ovary, and the ovule. And so that pollen grain comes in and does its thing, and that's where we get our fruit. We need those to be pollinated in order to get our fruit. So we love the flowers, but really it's because of the fruit. All right, next. So when you think about this, in my world, I plant flowers, and they're good for butterflies, they're good for bees, that stuff. And that's kind of where my focus pretty much is, right? But then you think about it, what are they really going after? They're not going after the flower, they're going after what's in the side of the flower, so they're going after the nectar generally, but they're actually going after the nectar and the pollen. And I've actually learned quite a bit through my preparation for this, that because I don't necessarily focus there, I focus more on creating that habitat, creating those flowers. So it's fun to learn a little bit more myself, but they're going after that nectar and pollen. And you can really nerd out on that if you want, about different plants and how much nectar they have, how much sugar concentration. This plant, they say from 8% sugar content to 50%. So each different flower is going to have a different attraction, and so they're obviously going to want to go after ones that have a higher concentration of sugar, and different species are going to want different things. So, all right, go ahead. And of course, we all know honey. That's a big part of what we do. So then within that flower, you have the nectar, and that nectar is made up of 80% water and 20% sugars. Sugars, fructose, glucose, and sucrose. So different sugars in there. So 80% water, 20% sugar, but then the bees convert it and make honey, and then the honey component's actually 20% water and 80% sugars. All right, next. Okay, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of habitat creation, creating wildflowers for pollinators, just habitat in general. It's not just flowers, but that's kind of our primary focus. All right, so the ins and outs of establishing a pollinator plot. Next. And so this is what we're trying to create, something that's going to attract them, something with color, different colors. Diversity is always best. Yes, go ahead. Yes. Yep, so that gets into, he's asking, I got to repeat the question. So he's wondering about pollinating as far as an individual plant versus cross-pollination. So that's a great point. So they can pollinate themselves, but we want diversity, we want strength, and the key to having plants that are going to really be robust is that they cross-pollinate. Just like we know genetics, we want to cross-pollinate. So that's why insects are so good, because they're mobile, they can travel long distances. So they're going to take the pollen from this, and they're going to spread it to the same species further away, a different plant, to get cross-pollination. And that's where you get more robust genetics, and you're going to have better plants in the long run because of that. Does that answer that? Yes, but they're just not going to be as that's not good for the long-term longevity of that plant species. You want the cross-pollination to have more robust genetics. That's basically my takeaway from everything I've looked at. Okay, so that's what we're looking to create, and that's what we're going to talk about. And there's different levels of what we would create. We're all in a different boat when it comes to our property that we might be thinking of, and that's what we're going to go through today. But that happens to be one planting at my place. Go ahead. Same thing, just a nice, diverse flower mix that's going to attract the pollinators. Next. Go ahead. Years ago, again, my septic mound. It's a great little spot to take pictures. Next. All right, different methods of creating pollinator habitat. So some people in here might live in town. You're specifically thinking of just a small landscaping plants that you're going to plant for pollinators. We're talking some individuals in a very landscape setting in mulch, but it's just an individual plant where you might go to the nursery and buy one plant and put it in mulch, and maybe 10, 12. So that's going to be how we're going to define just kind of like a small landscaping. And then we'll talk about planting seedling plug planting. So you're putting just plugs in, but a little bit larger than just putting a few around your landscaping around your house. Maybe a larger, but it's just dealing with plugs themselves. And then we're going to go into seeding small plots, but actually putting seed in the ground, but just like a small area, maybe on the edge of your yard. And then we'll talk about establishing seeding large units of prairie as well. Again, if anyone has any questions, like he did, go ahead and ask. All right, next. Okay, site selection factors. So what are you thinking for a site? You're thinking plant community selection. Jay and I were talking earlier about specifically low plant material, so things that grow lower to the ground. So in the native plant community, you have two main types. You have your short, dry prairie mixes, and then you have your wet or your tall mesic prairie mixes that grow taller. So we'll get into that, but that's what you need to be thinking about for selection. Do you want shorter plant species or taller plant species? And that's the beauty of natives. There's so many. You can pick ones that'll match up to what you're looking for. You need to think of soil type. Is it clay? Is it sand? Is it good loam? Drainage, moisture. If it gets wet, maybe a low spot in your yard. Not good for short dry, but great for tall wet. You could go into the whole concept of a rain garden, great for pollinators. I don't have a bunch of slides for rain gardens, but that you can kind of apply if you're thinking more of that rain garden thing, but you're just dealing more with wet plants, but there's a lot of options there as well. So drainage and moisture is a big part of it. Sunlight, how much sunlight is the site you're thinking of getting? Is it full sun, partial sun, shade? And generally, a lot of, obviously, flowers like full sun, and they're going to get more nectar if they have more sunlight. But you got to work with what you have, so we'll talk about all of it. And then the other site selection factor, Jay and I were talking, sometimes your neighbors. I got some stories there, dealing with neighbors, and it's a hairy one. So before you go gangbusters, you got to be thinking through all these different things, and that's actually probably sometimes the most important one if you live in town. I worked for Prairie Restorations. I was in charge of all the controlled burns we did, and we were right in residential St. Louis Park. And we're there with all of our fire units and gear and people, and we're going to light this up. We're right on the corner of a residential lot, corner lot, two roads, and the neighbors there, and there's all the police officers there, and the police officer pulls me off to the side, and he's like, "You have the permits to do this. You have every right to do this, but I suggest you don't." And the neighbor said, "If you start that fire, I'm going to sue you, and I'm going to sue you, and I'm going to sue you, and I'm going to sue you." And that's basically how it went down. So it can get a little iffy when you're dealing with these things that don't look pristine. So that's why we're going to go through all the different types of plantings for you. So go ahead. So getting back to what I was saying earlier, you have short dry species. That's actually, that one on the left is called blue grama. It's a real short grass. It has little eyebrow looking seed heads, kind of a cute little plant, but grows real short. Versus big blue stem, tall mesic. You think of Lewis and Clark and their stories on their expedition going out west, and they're talking about walking through 7-8 feet tall prairie, and that's like big blue stem. It doesn't always grow that big, but anywhere from that 4 foot range, 5 foot range, 6 foot range. So you have different options there to think about. That's just grasses, and flowers the same thing. There's shorter flowers and tall flowers. Next. Okay, so now we'll talk specifically about just kind of that small landscaping, pollinator planting. So you're choosing individual plants that are going to go in a specific spot. Like, I'm going to put this plant here, this plant here, this plant there. And not a lot of diversity necessarily, pretty easy to establish. And that's generally going to be just landscaping around your house or your yard in little mulched areas. Next. So that would be a good example. You have just kind of a garden bed with some mulch, and you're putting individual plants in. And you can get a fair amount of diversity, and it's going to be a great attractor for pollinators. So if that's as far as you want to go with it, or with your property, you can get a lot of good pollinating habitat in something small like that. All right, next. The benefits of a small plot like that: it's a minimal site prep. It's easy to do without chemical site prep. Low cost generally. Has a real organized look. Your neighbors might like it. Low maintenance generally, and quick establishment, because if you go to a nursery and you're buying a potted flower plant, you know, that thing's going to bloom that year already, where not so much the case when you're seeding a pollinator plot. All right, next. Okay, so here's one I did in Litchfield a couple years back. A lady had a backyard, and she had all these cute little sculptures and type stuff in a bed, and it got away from her and was all full of trees and overgrown, and she ended up getting one of those bee pollinator grant or whatever that she was able to get. So she had me come in, and we drew up a plan and converted this. So go ahead, next picture. First thing was to get it all cleaned up, get all those trees out of there. Next. And then I worked it all up, got it down to the bare soil. And then you can see the plugs I have there. So this is just putting plugs in on this one. Next. So there, I got all the plugs in specific spots. It's a little shadier in the back, and so each of those plants had a sunlight requirement, and so I had to very scientifically go through, and this one should go here and this one should go there, and kind of mix them up in little pockets, and not just random, but each plant had a destination in that little garden there. And then I came in with mulch, and I mulched the whole thing. So 2 ways you can do that. You could mulch the whole thing and then plant into the mulch, or you could plant them all if it's small enough. You gotta think about time and how much it would be to put mulch around each little plant. If you had too much, that wouldn't be real feasible. Then you'd want to go through the mulch. Okay, she's asking if I put plastic or newspapers down. I do not. You could put newspapers. That would be one option. Plastic, I've done some in plastic, so not at that scale. If it was maybe 20, 30 plants, you know, putting into existing plastic with like river rock, I did that a few years back. It actually turned out really, really good. But that one didn't have anything other than bare soil in there. Yes? No, she's asking if you use newspapers, do they last long? No, they don't. But it's going to basically those weeds are going to come up when you have disturbed soil, and so it's going to buy you a little time, let those plants get established. You know, it's probably just a year, obviously. You can do cardboard. In my garden at home, I do cardboard and straw to keep the weeds at bay, and cardboard lasts longer than newspaper. But yeah, newspaper does not buy you much time, but it allows those natives to get established so you can deal with the weeds. At least you have the natives established. Yep. Yep. All right. Yes. So with those trees, I just pulled them out. So it's up to you whether you want to. In this case, you wouldn't have to till it up because you're just putting plugs in, and I'm not seeding it. So you never want to disturb soil if you're not seeding it, because all you are is bringing up weed seed. So in this case, I wouldn't want to bring up any soil if I didn't have to, because I'm just putting those individual plugs in. Then you're not bringing up the seed bank. All right, next. Okay, so there you can kind of see each individual plant that was put in before I put the mulch down. Next. Okay, plant choices. Obviously, there's a huge amount out there. Here's one of my favorites, butterfly weed. Do you know about butterfly weed? So it's in the milkweed family, Asclepias. So it's in the milkweed family, but it's absolutely a gorgeous plant. I love that color. Not necessarily. So that's where, with my schooling and everything, I mean, you go straight Latin, so you end up just nerding out on the Latin, and then you know for sure. You know, I don't remember the scientific family name, but the genus is Asclepias. And so when you have the genus and species in the Latin, then you know what you know, and that way it's universal. And that's why it's nice on those tags. If you can get into that, you can always match up the Latin, then you know for sure. Yeah. Yeah, that's fine. She's asking about problems with this plant that she might have. Yep. Yeah, they love full sunlight. Full sun is where they're going to thrive, and drier. You got it up higher and drier, but yeah, that might be your main factor there. Yes, Jay. Okay, so you would think that the first thing I'm going to have up here, the first picture of a flower, is going to be common milkweed. And in fact, I sent you my slides, and as soon as I was done, I was trying to wrap everything up. I'm like, I don't have common milkweed on any one of my slides, even though that's a huge part of what I got going on here. But when it comes to these first ones, the small plots, maybe with mulch, maybe with plastic, you would plant common milkweed. So common milkweed is absolutely crucial to monarchs. However, in a small planting, I don't promote it initially. In a small seeding, which I'll get into next, like just a small plot, I'm not going to go buy common milkweed plants and put them in, because those things are going to establish quickly, and they might already be in the seed bank. And if they're already in the seed bank, like at my place, I would kill off an area, because that's how I do it with chemical. And I got milkweed in there, I'll try to kill that milkweed, because there's no competition for that thing, and it's going to go gangbusters with no competition. And it's a beautiful plant in a nice diverse prairie, but while there's the ground is still just not filled in yet, it's going to want to fill in and become very aggressive. And so I never promoted initially. However, I definitely wanted a part of my prairie, and it will be. But on the onset, I try to keep it at bay. And you can introduce it after the fact on a small plot. Like if you're doing it around your house, a small backyard thing, get everything established, and you can get common milkweed put in. It's real easy to get in there, but it can get a little out of control, and especially if you want diversity. So. Yeah, for milkweed, yeah, it's a couple years. Yep. Butterfly weed, couple years. With butterfly weed, you put a little plug in the ground, a little seedling. You know, you'll get a little flower the first time. The next year, you'll get a little bit more, because a number of stems. But when that thing matures, it has 10 stems, and each stem is just full of flowers. And then it takes 3, on average, for perennials to become mature. But yeah. I think it's a couple years. Yeah. But I mean, if it's there, if you have a plant, I mean, the monarchs will use it no matter what stage it's on. If it's there, they'll eat on it. So. No, I'll find it growing randomly around my place. I love it. The weeds around my place are turning into wildflowers. I'm like, oh, I didn't plant that. You know, popping up all over, and I'll find butterfly weed in random spots. Yeah. Yeah, so it spreads rhizomatically. So it'll come up and then it'll start spreading roots, its rhizomes out, and it'll pop up, kind of like aspen trees do that. So it's very rhizomatic and spreads. Yep. Yeah, you get a lot of seeds in there. Yep. But they're going to find bare soil to establish. If you get a nice established native planting, those seeds aren't going to find a home real easily. Yeah, he's asking if I pull milkweed out, you're not really affecting it. Probably not too much. There's a lot of plants like that where people think they're doing something. I mean, you're preventing it from going to seed and whatever, and it's not getting photosynthesizing as much, so it's not putting as much, but they're pretty robust. I work on farm field edges a lot, and they spray year after year after year, and there's common milkweed growing along every field edge pretty much, which is bad because all the butterflies are on them and they're getting sprayed, but it's hard to kill that stuff.
Okay, so if you got this milkweed, and more of it than just two plants in the garden or something, and you need to cut some of it down, but you want it to keep growing.
Yep.
So is there a guideline? You only cut down, like if I want to take a plant and put it in my cage like that.
Yep.
If I cut it down and leave the two bottom leaves, it's going to grow quicker, or only take the top two or three so you need more plant.
I mean, generally where you have one, if it's established, there's usually seldom is it one plant, and so generally for all nature, if you're going out and harvesting anything, there's a 20% rule. If you're going to go harvest seeds for personal use, 20% rule. If you're going to go harvest berries in the wild, blueberries, you only harvest 20%, and then you move on and harvest 20%. So that's the general nature rule, but again, it's a robust plant. It's coming back the next year. As far as that year goes, if you could leave it, and I don't know how much it would come up that year still, but there should be enough. Yeah, for this, we just pluck leaves for this. We never at home with raising butterflies. We just use leaves. We don't take stem. Yes, we'll just pluck a couple.
And also it's frustrating, I see the highway guy mowing all the ditches.
Yeah.
And now all that milkweed in the ditch is down to, about this much.
Yeah.
And I know the butterflies like, or the caterpillars like the fresh young leaves.
Fresh young. Yep. Yep. Yep.
And when my friends are asking how much to cut or take or what, I'm just trying to evaluate what's the method of, don't want to kill the plant, we want to kill the.
Yeah, you're not going to kill the plant, and I guess I have the luxury where there's enough out there where I don't even have to think about that at my place. We have some growing wild in our rocks. I don't even want it there, but it is like literally right in front of my porch, and I can't get rid of the stuff. And there's always some. We're never at a need to go much further than that, and that just grew up wild. So it's hard to, in my mind, that you'd ever get rid of it. But all right, so butterfly weed, that's a great one, great choice for kind of these landscape settings. If you were to have to pick a few, that would definitely be on my list. Go ahead. Blazing stars are another one. There's meadow blazing star, rough blazing star, and prairie blazing star. Butterflies absolutely love them. I'll have one, even when my blazing star was young, at one plant, and you'd see 5 to 10 monarchs come and landing on that one plant. The whole plant's going over with the monarchs. They absolutely love blazing stars, and I like it too because compared to the butterfly weed, it has a greater longevity of flowering time-wise because it flowers at the top and works its way down. You can see on the bottom there, they're not bloomed out yet. So you'll get flowers, then you get more flowers, you'll get maximum amount, and then they'll start receding from the top. But you have a long flowering window for monarchs with blazing star. So it's a great plant, great for a small landscape setting if you're just had to pick a few plants. Go ahead. This isn't my specialty, but herbs. Some of you would probably do the herbs. I do hyssop, fragrant giant hyssop. The first one, that's actually part of all my prairie mixes. And so that's one that I do plant with native wildflowers. But that's another one I would definitely go with. And just from my research for my presentation here, a lot of people do just a lot of your herbs. So you can picture a landscape garden. Obviously, if you want herbs in there that to consume, you could create a landscape plot with more natives in the back, and then near the edges you could have your herbs, which the pollinators are going to love. Then you can harvest your herbs closer to your yard or walkway. That's hyssop, fragrant giant hyssop. So later in the season, if you crush it, it smells just like anise. It smells just like black licorice. Every time I see it, I don't like black licorice, but I love that. You can just take that and rub it, and it smells just like anise. Very nice plant. And bees love that plant. I got a little patch at my place, and the whole patch just makes this big sound. As those bees that just cover the whole thing. And so basically, it seems like it's alive, my hyssop plant patch. So herbs are another great choice for these small landscape plots. All right, go ahead. Yeah, yep. Yep, and I collect tons of seeds for mine every year, and so that's a pretty hardy plant. It grows readily. When I seed a prairie, not everything comes up. It's nature, but that's one that generally pops up in most of my seedings. Go ahead. Okay, site prep options on the small scale. You can, if it's small enough, you can just do simple sod removal, or you just take that sod layer off and plan your planting after that. You can do ground cover. We talked about cardboard. Can do plastic. It's an option. I'm not huge on that. That landscape fabric, if you look into that, there's a lot of articles that are coming more and more against that landscape fabric, where it erodes anyhow, and you end up, it's kind of worthless, but then it breaks down, and then you deal with all that fabric. Or you could do ground cover. Some people plastic for 2 years as a site prep, if that's an option, where you just kill everything off by keeping it covered for a couple years, and then transitioning into getting the soil worked up, or whatever you want to do for what you're planting into it for pollinators. The other option is chemical, a kill-all like glyphosate. And basically the follow-up then is mulching is the best option for when you're doing those small landscaping plots. All right, next. Okay, so now we'll go into the next one. That'd be kind of a small landscaping pollinator seeding plus the seedling planting. So I'm going to seed it plus put individual plants in, which is kind of geared towards pollinators. So I'll seed it, and then I'm going to put those plants in that we kind of highlighted specifically for pollinators. Because when you seed, you get what comes up. And like blazing stars, I think in my septic mound in 08, I maybe in the whole seeding had one blazing star that came from the seeding. So it doesn't, it's in the seed mix, but you don't find it too often. So here's where you get to highlight individual plant species. This would be a scenario where you might just be landscaping around your house, a backyard, some little pockets, prairie pockets you might call them. We call them postage stamp prairies. Just put a little postage stamp prairie in the backyard or along the house. This compared to the last one, you get more diversity, more habitat. All right, next. Here's one I did over in Maple Lake a number of years ago. She had bushes, a burning bush all along her house, and ripped all those bushes out, killed it all off, and seeded that. And then along the wall, I ended up putting, I actually did both. I did Indian grass and big blue stem clump grasses. Nope. So I had put blanket down. So that's after the seeding. I put erosion blanket. So I'll generally seed a small project like that, and on the seeding side. So I seed it, put erosion blanket, and then I plant the plugs into the erosion blanket. All right, next. So that's after establishment when the flowers all bloomed. And so that's going to be the short dry prairie I was talking about. So your short grasses like blue grama, side oats grama, and little blue stem are your major ones. Your two most major ones are side oats grama and little blue stem. You'll find a couple other species, but that's your main component for grasses in a short dry prairie. And then just a mixture of wildflowers. All right, go ahead. All right, another picture of it, and then one more. So again, I talked about specifically then planting plugs, seedlings into the seeding to go after the pollinators, and they're just aesthetically beautiful. The blazing stars, the hyssop, the butterfly weed. That's a kind of a classic example of a seeding, and then I put that blazing star in there to kind of be a. That is the prairie blazing star. So you have meadow blazing star, prairie blazing star, and rough blazing star. They do. These are bigger, more robust heads on them. They're different when you look at them, when you get up close. But from a distance, I agree they look similar. All right, next. Oh, sorry. Yes. The white flowers, those were ones I didn't even plant. They're just kind of like a little daisy. They just kind of like you disturb soil and you get weeds. Well, some weeds are actually beneficial to pollinators. But other white ones that would be in there, the main one would be yarrow. So I'm sure in your herb class that you did earlier, you talked about yarrow, great for cuts and wounds and all sorts of different ailments. All right, next. Okay, again, site prep on this. You could do the sod removal, ground cover, or chemically treat it to site prep. When you get into site prep, Jay and I were talking, site prep's king, or the key to prairie. Small scale, large scale, it's all about site prep. If you don't site prep long enough, properly, your prairie will still come in, but you're going to end up fighting a lot of cool season grasses like turf grass. You try to kill off turf. You try to not use chemical. Even when you use chemical, you get seed bank in there, and some of that turf, that Kentucky bluegrass comes back, and you end up dealing with it more. So it's really, the longer you site prep, the better off your prairie's going to be when it gets established. But you can't do it always. So, I mean, like 2 years. Who wants to wait 2 years of site prep? Most people don't. And so it's like, okay, well, we can do it, but it's going to come with more maintenance issues. So, all right, next. Okay, now we'll get into a small prairie seeding. So it's big enough that I'm not putting any plugs in probably or specific plants. I'm just seeding this one. We'll get back. This will be my septic mound I'll start with. So with this, you save time and money on the scale of your yard, for my example. Mowing, watering, fertilizing. I have an acre yard when I bought the place, and that whole back corner was a septic mound, and I'm like, nah, I don't need to mow all of this. And so killed off that whole septic mound and seeded it and blanketed it. And
You speak a lot about the septic mound.
yeah.
I did ours years ago, and had somebody come in and put wildflowers
Yep.
in there, and I had to cut it down because the gophers just went into my septic system, and there was
They got into the system. So I do struggle with gophers. I have the whole time, pocket gophers. But I've never had any issue. Did they actually cause an issue with the septic?
well, I was advised that it would if I
Yeah.
didn't deal with it.
Yeah.
And so we basically just had a whole
Yeah, I mean, we just had our septic clean last year. Headland came out, and I mean, my septic was right there, and I told him about it. He didn't say anything about it, but I was I was kind of like, I hope this isn't an issue, because the beautiful thing about native grasses, native prairie, if you look at sod roots, I don't know if you've seen those pictures. If you look at roots of sod, like your Kentucky bluegrass, you know the roots, they go down like that. Well, if they've done cross sections of the prairie, like out in the Dakotas with a huge excavator, and just absolutely made a straight wall, And there's big blue stem, those prairie grasses, they go down 15 to 20 feet. Just fibers. I mean, that's just, you can look it up on the internet. It's just amazing, a cross-section of a prairie. And you think from a water perspective, all the water filtration and the runoff, that water hits the landscape, and it's got to filter through 15 to 20 feet of fibrous roots before it's flushing out of the system, versus turf grass. That water hits it, goes through, and you're right into the soil system. So it's really cool. So I was a little concerned when I planted mine, but I see the companies, they sell septic mound prairie mixes. So I'm like, well, it must be all right. And I've had mine in since '08, and I've had the gopher issues. I've had that very top stays hot and dry, and initially I had some good natives that can handle hot and dry, and it's still a struggle on the very top. The gophers, yeah. Yeah, I guess that I'll mention that too. Here's the caveat of planting some of these next to your house. If you don't think you're going to have more rodent issues, you're fooling yourself. I mean, so that is kind of one thing you got to think about. I mean, you're going to have rodents and snakes living in this setting, so you got to pick your preferences there. Pollinators or no, you're creating that habitat. Yeah. And so snake, I transplanted 6 snakes last week across the creek. No. So it comes with the habitat. So yeah, you save time and money mowing, watering, fertilizing by switching over to natives. That's obviously the big selling point. You're enhancing that beauty around your property. You look out your back window and you see all those flowers when they're in bloom. And you're just bringing more diversity and habitat for all sorts of critters, good or bad. Yeah, I mean, you look, my client there, we went right next to her house. And yes, so would I recommend a spacing between your house and structures and it? For that reason, yes, but if you got a house that's don't have holes in it, and and a cat, I guess. So so there are a few trade-offs. I ain't gonna lie. But from a pollinator perspective, if that's what you have to work with, it's a great choice. All right, next. So again, here's my septic mound back in '08. It looks very different now. Those trees are really big. And so I killed everything off with glyphosate, let it die, and I missed a few spots. So I went back again and killed it all off again, any spots that I missed, and then I tilled the whole thing up. The place I bought had irrigation system. I ripped all the irrigation with my tiller. So now I don't have irrigation system anymore. And then I seeded it with different mixes based on short dry up on top, short dry on the edges, mesic towards the back. That's just a technique that I usually do, so you get better visual if you have the shorter stuff up front. Many of you that landscape, it's the same concept. And then I let her go. And so in '08, and I went back there in 2013 with a little notebook, and I counted 31 species of flowers and 9 species of grasses without ever putting a plant in, just seed. I had 40 different species. One issue with that, and I'll just let you know that, so who knows Monarda, bee balm, you know that plant? Bees love it, so that was in the mix, and I would never put it in a mix again for a small plot because it took over. It kind of spreads rhizomatically, and that little beautiful bee balm plant, I don't know if you can buy them from a nursery. They're different varieties from the nursery, and I don't think they're going to act in that same way. But it spread and took over, and it seeded, and all of a sudden you just have a third of your nice diverse prairie is primarily bee balm or Monarda, and so that was a little bit of a bummer, and I just didn't have the time to manage it out. And so there are some complexities to doing this where you think it's ideal, but you find nature is different. All right, any questions on that, on what I did there? All right, next. Okay, there's just kind of you've seen that picture before, but give you an idea of some good pollinator habitat. Next. Here's one on Star Lake over by Litchfield. They were mowing 5 acres of yard. They were mowing for years, 5 acres, and they were tired as they're getting closer to retirement. And so we punched out 3 acres of it and turned 3 acres of it into native prairie. So there's the kind of before I had done a site prep spray. Go ahead. And there's the process of me seeding those 3 acres. A couple different seed mixes. Down where the trees are, it was low and wet. And so I planted more of a tall wet mix in there and a mesic mix higher up. Next. Just another picture of that seeding. Next. This is actually Lakeside, or whatever the name is, in Dassel at the nursing home. So that's what it was when I came in, just kind of brome grass and a bunch of trees popping up on the hillside to the lake, to Spring Lake. Next. Killed that off and seeded that and blanketed that next. And then we put some plugs in there as well. All right, next. So that's erosion control blanket. So definitely on a hillside like that, you're going to have to put erosion blanket down. And even on my septic mound, I did it. So one, it shades the soil. So on this is a smaller setting. It shades the soil so it stays more moist. It keeps that moisture in, so it gives a better environment for the seeds. It'll inhibit weed germination and then prevent erosion. So it's more than just erosion control. It actually is good for that seeding. And it doesn't affect the seeding at all. It just comes right through it and disappears. So it's plastic meshing, biodegradable plastic meshing with little squares, and then it's all straw woven through it. And you can get single or double thickness. I get a lot of mine, Maple Lake, at that country store in Maple Lake, the Senex or whatever, and they sell 8-foot rolls, and I get them other places too, but that's a place that anyone can go, and just right there in the summertime they sell them 4-foot rolls or 8-foot rolls. So good for any small seeding that you'd be doing. I'd recommend it. And then you just put metal staples in it and don't worry about them. They go away eventually, and I haven't had any issue with putting those in ever. Next. Okay, most of you probably recognize this place. This is Syngenta across from the high school. I seeded that a couple years ago, and it's doing pretty good. But we had 2 years of drought, so here's another variable. We're trying to do all of this, and you just go with what you do, and you get everything prepped, and then you seed it. Well, nature comes along and spits zero moisture at you, and so I'm actually quite happy with this, considering 2 years of drought. Certain things germinate. Some they're still sitting there maybe, and they're going to germinate. You don't know. So there's no perfect science. If I was an installer of church pews here or trim work, and I came in and you hired me, I do the trim job, you know exactly what I did, and you pay me and I leave, right? Andy, I threw seed in at your place, walking away like this. Let's hope for there's no obvious, I know what you just did, and you just walk away and hope for the best. And the beautiful thing about natives is they've handled this environment, and you go out to the Dakotas where it's high and dry and nothing but sand, and it's all prairie. I mean, these things can handle what Mother Nature gives, but getting no moisture does make a challenge for germination. But anyhow, this is Syngenta, so keep your eye on that. As over the years, it'll change. If you look initially, all that yellow, so when you do a seeding, you get pioneer species. You got the first ones that venture in. Well, that's black-eyed Susan. So you get a new seeding, and the whole thing will be black-eyed Susan. Some people will be like, oh, I love it, I love it, I love it. I'm like, Well, they're not going to be there because they're pioneer species. Next year, there'll be some, and the next year, there'll be a few, and then after that, there might not be any. And so it can be disappointing for someone. Oh, I love it. You did such a great job. It's like, well, I hope don't get too set on that because it's about to change. And so, which is really fun when you get into prairies and see how they change from year to year. But you don't want to get your heart set on certain species necessarily. So there's pioneer species that come in, and that's what the yellow is. It's a black-eyed Susan. All right, next. Oh, I guess I had them flip-flopped a little bit. But that was just kind of the look of site prep before I worked it up. Next. And there's the black-eyed Susan. So on that one, again, from an aesthetic view, I planted the edges in short dry mix, and then I planted the center with the taller mix. So that way, anyone going by it's going to be more visual. Yeah. They're going to need bare soil. You can get tons of seeds off of those heads. So they're dropping, and you'll get some, but it's amazing how they go away. Because I can go out now, even after those seed heads have been sitting all winter, and I can take one and shake it in my hand, and I'll get a bunch of little seeds in my head. And they grow very easily, and it's easy to collect the seed. They're really tiny little black seeds. But they need that bare soil. The problem is once a prairie gets established, like a little grass seed will land in my seeding, and then it'll germinate. And when it's mature in a few years, it's taking up 1 square foot of space. And so I got a grass here, grass there, in this small area. I already taken up 8 square feet of space. And so I'm just looking for germination. And once I got germination, the client will be like, I don't think it's coming in. I'll be like, get on my knees and we'll look, and one here, we're good. And walk away because it's coming in. But yeah, they need that bare ground to germinate without competition. But good for pollinators. Next. Here's another conversion, beautiful home, Buffalo, swimming pool, backyard, but they had beyond the backyard, and they wanted that to look beautiful too. It looks wild, but I came in and killed it all off and worked it up. So this is kind of a before picture. Go ahead. Before. Next. Killed it all off, worked it all up. Got it all seeded, blanketed that. Obviously in a high-end one like that, I really want it to do well close to the yard where they're going to see it. So I put blanket down, and I didn't put any plugs in, but I put blanket down just to kind of give it that crisp, clean look. Next. And that's one of my best projects. It just, you walk away, cross your fingers, and it just came in perfect. Real happy with that project. And just pollinators just all over it. All right, next. Next. Once established, and that's the selling point, because obviously a lot of people are converting to prairie, and I mean you have to have some selling points in there, and the selling point that people give for it is it's low maintenance and the economics of watering and stuff. So it's generally low maintenance. We'll get into it a little bit, but 3 to 5 years of establishment where you might have to do some pretty active management to get it to that point where you can kind of walk away. At that point, it's how particular you want to be. If it's a small one near your house, you're going to spend more time in there nitpicking it. When I worked for Prairie Restorations, we had some people, they loved, their prairies were their children. I'm no joke. They didn't have children. Their prairies were their children, and they babied these things. Scissors, they're on their hands and knees, and they're scissoring, and it was a little over the top. They had birthday parties. Oh, and then whenever we'd show up, they're having birthday party. Oh, this one's 1 year old, and this one's 5 years old. And anyhow, so it depends on how much you want to get into it. So, and what you consider a need to step in and deal with some things. But does it go away? No. I mean, once those natives get established with deep root systems, they go. However, a prairie tends to convert to grasses over the long run. You do lose that flower component. So when I get a seeding in, I get germination, see what I have, and if I need to get flowers in, you got a couple years to get more flowers in. I just looked at one in Cokato here, and that's how we got to get more flowers in now, instead of letting all those grasses get established and then try to get flowers in, because those grasses, again, if it takes up that foot of space and you have one there, you got to fill those pockets in with flowers, otherwise they're going to lose out, and it will get to grasses sooner than later. Yeah. And so that's if you don't maintain it and just walk away, you'll see that transition. Certain species will disappear and then it'll be more grass dominated. Are they going anywhere? No. They'll be there forever. So from a pollinator perspective, and when you're doing this, you got to think more heavier on the flowers. If you want this to truly be a pollinator plot, if you look at the seed mixes that you can buy out there, they have pollinator mixes, and those are going to be heavier on the flowers, and really try to get those in. So, yes, sir. No, the grasses are there forever. Like if you walked away and didn't manage your prairie or anything, just kind of walked, the grasses, some of those flowers will go away. Everything got filled in with all the grasses. Unless if they're certain species that they're just robust, they're always going to be in there in the mix. But that's where you get into the fire component. Fire's it's a little bit off topic to our pollinator, but not really. I mean, fire is the best tool for managing prairie is fire. Sure. So when I worked for prairie restoration as the management coordinator, I wrote 90 to 100 burn plans every winter to do in the spring. We didn't get them all done, but I wrote 90 to 100 every spring. I mean, we're burning prairies. I can see target field from where we were burning. We were all over the cities doing burns. Every stormwater pond in Golden Valley, burn it every 3 years. Well, guess what? Guess whose business doesn't do burning as part of their business? I don't even do burning as part of my business. I'll help Andy out if he wants, but it's his burn. I always quoted $25,000 annual premium to burn. Some springs it's so wet and the weather don't come, you can't even get a burn done. You'll never pay for your premium. So I can't even burn with my business. I miss it. I love it. You mow it. Not ideal, but that's your only bet to really have a healthy prairie is mow. In the springtime generally, because then you're going to scatter any flower seed. If you go in the spring, you go and you scatter all that seed. So all those flower seeds, when you hit that thing with a mower, they're going to find that open ground that still exists. Yeah, like right now when it's been so dry. Yeah, we do a spring dormant mows is generally what I do if people want the kind of prairie cleaned up, especially more residential area. They want kind of a clean look every year. And so we'll do a spring dormant mow. You can do a fall dormant mow or a spring dormant mow. But spring's good. Fall would work too. They've gone to seed at that point. But you spread that seed all over and find those hot spots. But it's amazing. I remember the 50-acre prairie, we burned part of it and then drove by the next year. You could see that line, just the robust color of the big blue stem after a burn. I mean, you could see that line. It looked like the same prairie, but just the colors that came out after a burn. It's such a healthier looking prairie after a burn. Yeah, all the grasses love burn, love fire. I mean, that's how they've handled themselves for thousands of years, is through fire. So, what are we on? Seeding, so chemical, or if you don't want to use chemical, you can do extended tillage. So you can work that ground up, till it up. You could till it up for the entire season and then seed it the next year. At a minimum. If you're not using chemical, you're going to have that thing. And we're talking about lawn conversion or grass conversion to prairie. Yep. Yep, but I believe that's like a 2 year to properly, yeah, yeah. Yeah, but it's feasible. I mean, people do it for a garden or whatever. It's just you got to be patient and have a lot of other things going on, so you don't have to be impatient. But yeah, yeah. I mean, it's for the most part, it's probably going to be good in a year. You could probably do it after a year, but site prep is key, and depends on how good of how sure you want to be that you're really doing it right. So, but you could do it 1 year, most of the next year, and then do a fall seeding. Install your project in the fall the following year. And you're not waiting a full 2 years. So, all right, next. So getting into large acreage, this is where we're getting in agricultural conversion from row crops, CRP, you guys know this Conservation Reserve Program. So that's going to be large acreage, taking a grassy field or a pasture and converting that. With that, I mean, you're getting into true prairie at this point. You're putting in, and when you're planting large acreage, you let that bee balm find its spot, and who cares if it grows into a 30 by 30 patch? It found its niche, and then these plants, you seeded here, they find their niche there, and that's the beauty of the large prairie. You can kind of watch it do its thing and watch nature take its course. When it's smaller, we feel like we need to manicure and manipulate it a little more because we want things the way we want things. But when you do large acreage, it's kind of fun. You can just watch nature do its thing. I remember when I worked for Prairie Restorations, one of the clients asked someone, so how long does it take for this prairie to get established? And he looked at her and he's like, about 50 years. When you start talking at the microbial level of all the different organisms and the roots and the bacteria and everything, to get all of that back to the way the ecosystem should completely function, I mean, it's decades. From our perspective, above ground, 3 to 4 or 5 years, and it's established as far as we're concerned. But I thought that was kind of an interesting answer, to truly get that restoration back, probably decades, to bring everything back into a proper ecosystem. Okay, next. So there's one at my place. It was all just pasture. It was alfalfa field. The alfalfa was going away. It was still had a bunch of grasses in it, cool season grasses. So I didn't mention that native grasses generally are warm season grasses. So if you go out now, your turf grass is greening up. And if I go into my prairies, I see certain grasses greening up, turf grass, certain cool seasons. But most of the premium or your main native grasses are warm season. So they're going to sit there brown, and they don't do their thing till the soil temperatures get over 60 degrees. And so some people, they want to get their prairie and seed it. Well, those seeds are going to sit there till it hits 60 degrees. Where in the meantime, if you seed it early, all those weed seeds, as soon as they get that soil temp and you're sending all those weeds up, where you know that most of those prairie seeds aren't going to germinate till June generally. This year will be a little different. So timing and the science behind it is key, but it still works. A lot of times I do a fall planting and it comes in just fine. So it's not much different. But so here's one. It was just, again, another chemical conversion, burned off the dead material, worked it up and seeded it. The other thing is I wouldn't need to work it up. You can do a frost seeding. We were talking about that beforehand. This is a great time of year to do frost seedings. You can do it with flowers and grasses. You can do it with lawn grass, anything. And frost seeding, it's when it gets warm during the day, and everything kind of melts, and then at night everything freezes up. And those soil the granules, they kind of harden up into these little granules, and then during the day they soften up. And so if you throw seed on top of it, frost seeding, as they melt, it kind of sets that seed. You want your seed just to be covered a little bit. And when you frost seed, it brings those seeds right into the soil just to that perfect level, and it's kind of letting nature do its thing. And then you wouldn't even have to till up the ground. And then the other option is no-till. So now they have no-till drills that basically it puts a little groove into the soil and it drops the seed into that groove. And so that's another way that a lot of people plant prairies is with a no-till. And then you never work up the ground and bring up those weed seeds. So that's kind of on the large scale. You have different options. Usually, go ahead to the next one. So this was agriculture field. It was row crop. He was enrolling it in CRP. That's over by Lake Jenny, just south side of Lake Jenny. And it was just row crop and enrolled it in the CRP program. So that was simple. The farmer came and just made it pretty smooth, and I came in and just threw seed over the top. And that's my seeder, and then I have a cultipacker that just presses that seed into the ground. That's a drop, so that's a broadcast. It's not a no-till. It's a broad, like Truax, they've been around for decades. They make no-tills, and that's a broadcast seeder. The nice thing, most of you this might not apply to, but the one nice thing about a broadcast seeder versus a no-till, the no-till leaves these grooves and everything's planted in straight lines. And so you can kind of see that versus this gives it more of a prairie, more of a natural look, but in the long run it don't matter too much. All right, next. There's my seed box. There's 3 different seed boxes in the cedar. One's for the larger grass seeds, and then I have a little box for the tiny itsy bitsy little flower seeds. They go through, and when you seed a prairie, I mean, when we do flower seeds, if it's let's say it was the size of this room, I would seed it in grass, and then I would take my flower seed and I would go like this. And you're just throwing pinches of this stuff. It doesn't even, you can't even tell what you're doing hardly. You're just grabbing little pinches and you're just throwing it, and that whole thing will be covered in wildflowers. And all you did is throw these tiny pinches. We were doing one prairie, like 7 acres, and they let some new hire, scatter the wildflower seed, and 7 acres. He comes back, hey, got any more seed? And he just threw thousands of dollars of seed, and he only got like 50 feet into the prairie or 50 yards in. So anyhow. Yep. So I have a seeder on large scale, so it drops the grass, but then it drops the flowers separately through a different box, so at a different rate, so it'll go slower. If on a small project, I would do it by hand. All right, next. Number of years ago, the governor, they'd passed the buffer law, so all the streams, all the ditches in Minnesota were required to have a vegetation put in, so they couldn't be farmed up there. So with my smaller equipment, I was able to capitalize on that and put a lot of native pollinator plantings along ditches around the area. Next. With my equipment, that's the largest I've done. That's 14 acres. That's a different one on the south end of Lake Jenny. That was 14 acres of putting prairie pollinator planting in. Next. Okay, so getting to prairie management, and this can be small scale to large scale, probably not the mulch small scale, but when you get into any of the seedings, you're looking at 3 to 5 years of active management to get fully established. In every prairie, every seeding is going to be different. Some of them, year 1, it's good. It's just everything's different. It depends on the weed seed bank that was in there. First year, it might just be, generally it's just a complete mow, because the natives are doing their thing, but they're just germinating, whereas the weeds are going gangbusters. You guys know how weeds go. I mean, 1 year for a ragweed, it's this tall. And so it's really just keeping the weeds mowed at 6 to 8 inch level, allowing the natives to keep germinating, getting some root establishment, but they're not shooting up, but they're getting established in the ground. And so it's basically weed management generally on that first year. Sometimes I've had them where I'll throw a cover crop in, the cover crop comes in, but the prairie comes in perfectly with hardly any weeds. But generally it would be mowing the first year. If you do the chemical thing for certain species, we never put chemical on a first year prairie. We wait till a year after seeding before we put chemical on. Year 2 would be spot mowing, generally with a little bit of chemical treatment if needed. And then year 3, Just depends on what you have, but at that point you're no longer mowing the whole thing down. You might be spot mowing a few patches. And then when I say chemical, I'm talking generally Canada thistle. Anyone ever tried to deal with Canada thistle in their garden? Does anyone? You know what, I mean, it's a rise. I say it's straight out of the pit of Hades, this plant, because one seed equals one plant that goes, the rhizomes, and it goes a foot underground and it shoots and it pops. And it shoots and it pops and it spreads. And you might see a patch of thistle the size of this room, and it's all one organism. Canada thistle. So if you go drive by like a pasture where cows are and you see a thistle, those are a biennial thistle. So it's just one seed produced one stalk, produced one plant, where Canada thistle is rhizomatic and it spreads a foot. Well, like sumac. Sumac's up high, but this one, it goes a foot down. It's in my garden, and I'm not putting chemical in years of trying to dig that down and get that root out. Yeah. So it's a perennial. So perennials, annual, annual, biennial, perennial. We'll get into that. So you have annual weeds, biennial weeds, and perennial weeds, and that determines your management. Annual weeds, like a foxtail weed, grass, it just comes up, does its thing, and it's done. Biennial, burdock, burdock, that'll do year one. It'll do a rosette stage where it'll do just a leaf stage at the ground level, and on year two is when it kicks up a stalk, goes to flower, and goes to seed. So it's not until the second year. It's a biennial. Those are pretty easy to deal with. Those are just keep them mowed, and once the prairie's established, those go away anyhow. But then the perennials are the tough ones that they come back year after year after year. And Canada thistle is the most difficult one, and people go in and they spray it with like a 2,4-D, a broadleaf, and that top kills it. So you think you killed it, but they don't understand that it goes a foot down, and all of those are one plant. And so people will top kill it. And so there's some specialized chemicals that you just, yeah, or you can keep mowing it. Honestly, pollinators love thistle. Goldfinches love thistle. I mean, pick your poison. It's really when you try just getting your prairie established. If it's in there, it's gotten free reign with no competition, kind of like we were talking about with the common milkweed. When I planted at Syngenta, I got my plot all. I knew that there's a little thistle in there, but what I didn't realize is in between the trail and Highway 12 and the trail, and then the trail to their mowed edge was all Canada thistle. So I had seeded my whole project just, perfect. And I watched as hundreds of thousands of seeds floated along the trail right in. My whole plot was like white with Canada thistle seed. Am I worried about it? It's not ideal, but I'll manage it. And I'm not going to douse the whole thing with chemical because I'm going to get prairie established. It's going to take its root, and there might be some Canada thistle in there, but I just need to keep it at bay to allow my stuff to get all established that I put in, and then I'll keep it at bay, and then I'm going to have to put a little chemical on it. But okay. Combination of mechanical and chemical treatment for weeds is standard practice. For aesthetic reasons, some people do that dormant mow that I talked about. You can do a fall dormant mow. From a pollinator perspective, you don't want to mow in the fall because those stems, all the insects and things that live in those stems, that's where they overwinter, hibernate. And if you go mow it all down, you're basically taking away their habitat. So it's not ideal. Sometimes from a friendly neighbor issue, that might be the option. Otherwise, people do a spring dormant mow if that's an option, and it's kind of give it a nice clean look to go for the year. It's not required, but it's more of an aesthetic thing. But it's something when we did a lot of our prairie work in the cities, it was pretty standard practice. Most people had that done. Then, as I talked about earlier, the best management tool for prairie, especially when you're talking the whole prairie complex of grasses, wildflowers, the whole mix is fire. All right, next. There's a little one I helped somebody out with. That's actually at Irene Bender's house. So just a little bit management fire we put through there. So managements are, if you have cool season issues, those cool seasons come up, and then you can put a hot fire through there, and it can really suppress those cool seasons. So that's how you can kind of maintain stuff so your prairie doesn't go away. It'll actually deal with a lot of those issues you have if you can time and trees. The other thing is trees. If you're putting a new prairie, you got a vision, you're going to put a prairie in, and you have a mother box elder tree right over it, or an elm, a Siberian elm, those things put hundreds of thousands of seed, and if you just basically made a garden bed for them, and then you plant your prairie, I mean, you have those ash trees by your place. I mean, they have potential. The mother trees, you want to get rid of those before you want to think about those things, because that's going to be an issue down the road with your establishment. But fire kills trees when they're little pretty good too. So that'd be a non-chemical approach to trees. Next. What time is it? 8 o'clock? Okay. You got to go. Thanks for coming. Okay, thanks for coming. I'm not going to go into that. Woodland, basically, you got a woodland. You got buckthorn issues. You clean it all up. You got to have a game plan. You can go to good flowering shrubs for pollinators, nannyberry, chokecherry, high bush cranberry, different ones that flowering shrubs. Plum, great for pollinators. And you can put wild flowers in the woods too. So some people, that's another part of things that they got to deal with, or woodland. Next, yeah, just you can scroll through woodland wildflowers. There's some beautiful woodland plants. Next, invasive species, another big part of my business. I'm not going to get into it now. It doesn't have to do with pollinators, but it's part of the nature complex. Those are all flowering plants that are invasive, and I deal with a number of those. Sometimes in some of your seeding projects, you might deal with those, but I'm just not going to go into it all tonight. But know that there's weeds, and then there's invasive weeds, invasive plants. Many of those are actually good for pollinators. Catch-22. You get an infestation of invasive full of flowers. It's like, do you get rid of it? And the bees love them, butterflies love them. So you have biennials and perennials. So Canada thistle is the one that's perennial and goes like your real big stalked ones that grow real tall and robust. Those are a biennial. And so at my place, I'll let them flower. I'll let the bees and butterflies do their thing. And then as they're about done, I'll chop them, throw them in the fire if there's some seed heads, but I allowed them to still be pollinator habitat. No, just one seed, one plant. One seed finds some soil and pops up. Yes, sir. So I do all of Cokato Townships. I've been doing Cokato Townships wild parsnip control for 6-7 years. Oh, it's for prairies or weeds, invasives. Yeah, so on the township side, and in town, that's where you get issues. When your neighbor calls and says your prairie is a big weed patch, there's issues there. On the township level, they just deal with invasives. Like I do all of Cokato Township's wild parsnip control, and I think I'm picking up all of Collinwood Township now too. Yeah, go ahead. I'll get right to it. Next, there's weed grasses, invasives. Next, trees and shrubs, like buckthorn. European buckthorn is major. Could do a whole seminar just on buckthorn and buckthorn control. Next, here's my good friend wild parsnip. So I honestly have pulled hundreds of thousands of them by the roots. Hundreds of thousands of them I've pulled by hand. That's how I started my business. I was at a voluntary level. I was out volunteering, just doing it, and just kind of transitioned right into what I'm doing. You got to be careful. So this is a phytophototoxin. Phyto is leaf. Photosynthesis is the sun. On a sunny day, if you get the oil of that parsnip on your skin, it's like acid. It basically burn your skin and you can be scarred for years if you really, if you're like four-wheeling through that stuff, where you're really slapping that oil in deep, you can be scarred for years. Canada thistle is one thing. They've been trying to get rid of that, but this is a whole nother baby. Yep. So on rainy day, nice, real cloudy day with no UV. Yep. So again, it has to be sunny. It's phytophototoxin. It's a biennial. Generally, it can act a little perennial, but it's a biennial. So year one, right now, I can go into my places where I deal with it. I can see all of the plants. They're even green now. They're already green. And so I can actually know my infestation level because I have this year's plants and then next year's plants. So I can see when they're all flowered, I can go through my area and see all of next year's plants. So I have the opportunity to actually spray next year's plants. They're all green down here, but they're not way up here where they're doing that yet. And so I can hit two birds with one stone. I can go out and attack the 1 year. I can actually attack 2 year classes, so I can really get ahead of them. I have 5-year burn pile sitting at home that as soon as it snows on Thursday is going up in smoke. I have a huge burn pile. So I don't even have them. I have a few that pop up on my property because I dump them at my place. If they've already kind of gone to seed, if it's even close, I bring them home. I don't leave them on site if they could go to seed. But 900 seeds a plant, and I've pulled I've pulled billions of potential seeds over the last 6-7 years. I wear a long sleeve shirt with just those latex lined rubber gloves on this side. The one time I got burnt, year 2 or 3, it's usually a heat index when I'm pulling this stuff. Like those heat index days, 100-some, where I've wrecked my glasses from sweat. Like the sweat took the coating off my glasses, but it's always like 100-some degrees, I swear, in July when I'm doing this. And so I'm wearing that. I'm soaking wet with sweat. I drive home to empty my stuff. I didn't want to put my nasty, sweaty shirt back on, so I tried to carefully throw it in the burn pile, and I got a couple nicks on my arm. That's about the worst I've ever gotten, which really isn't bad. If you look this up on the internet, you'll be absolutely almost disgusted of what it can do to you. Oh no, I'm pulling in a day thousands and thousands, and I never wash my shirt the whole season. Never had an issue. That's my issue with hundreds of thousands of plants. But people that get into this stuff that don't know about it, they just get they're like, I'll have it rub me a little bit, but when you're getting into it, there's people that are hand pulling it, no idea what it is, and they're getting it on their hand. They're four-wheeling through it, and yeah, it's a nasty plant. So that's a big one to look out for, especially if you own property. So if you're a prairie, if you're into the pollinators and stuff on a larger scale, you could run into this. Next. It's okay. So there's a one arm load. That's my nephew, but yeah, my second year into it, I pulled 60,000 myself. Counted everyone. What else do you do? I make piles of 100. Yep. Yep. Yeah, it's a biennial. Yeah, that would work. Yep. If you cut them though, they'll still biennials like burdock, any biennial. When that plant biologically says it's time to flower, you can cut it to the base, or time to go to seed, and it'll grow that much, and it'll just kick out seed as much as it can. There's so much energy in there. When their biology says it's time, it's obviously not going to grow this big and produce 900 seeds, but they'll still kick up, and there's still no leaves on it. They'll go do their seed thing. Yep. Yeah. They say seed bank, initially when I first started, they said seed bank's 4 years. I'm seeing it's more. Because I've been, when I pull, I know I got 100%, because if it's all yellow, people are like, why don't you spray it? I'm like, I do, but I do a hand pull too, because if it was a room, 40 acres, you think I'm going to know I got every plant with that chemical? It's like, no, you go through, and then you come back, and after they go to flower, and then you can see all the ones you missed, and then you hand pull those out, and then you look, there's no yellow left. There might be a few that haven't flowered yet, but pretty much you know you got it. But yeah, there's an art to it, but it's not rocket science. Next, garlic mustard, that's in the woodlands, very prolific. I borrowed a piece of equipment one year from Prairie Restorations for the weekend, did my trails. I've been fighting that stuff for a dozen years. Just because the seed was on my equipment. Not real common, but it's here. It's in the spring, earlier summer, but white flour on top. You can eat it. It's a great edible. It's like garlic and mustard. Next, European buckthorn. Next, here's go ahead. There's a property. You can see that view. Came in and took out the buckthorn next. And there's the lake. Next. Okay, so real quick, anyone ever use these? Who uses these? Anyone know what this is? So this is for those of us that really nerd out on this stuff. You start raising monarchs. So you find their little caterpillar stage. They might be this big, or they might be that big, or the eggs. Yeah, you can find the eggs under the leaf, and you take that whole leaf if you found the eggs, or you might find just a little caterpillar, and they grow so fast. I can't remember. I mean, it's ridiculous how much they grow in a day. And then you just bring the caterpillars, unzip it, set them in here, put a milkweed leaf in there or two, and they'll nibble and chew and chew and chew and chew. And once they get big enough, they generally come up to the top. If you see the top there, they come to the top and they cling on and they form their chrysalis and they sit in their chrysalis. And then you can tell as that develops and they get darker and darker, and then you know it's coming that day, and you can get all excited and, oh, there's going to be a butterfly today, and then all of a sudden you look and sometimes you get to witness the whole hatching out of the chrysalis, or you just look over and, oh, there's a butterfly or two, and then we release them, and it's fun. We homeschool our kids, so I mean, it's just a great home activity that we're just all the time. I found, kids come in, I found another one. And so we do many of those every year, and so that's something that you can do for pollinators, for monarchs. The other thing is for bees. You can put the bee houses up. Have you seen those? That little places, that little wood structure that bees can live in. Great for pollinators. So, next. So creating all this habitat, pollinators is great from our side. The human benefits, the mental health of just creating these wildflowers, going outside. I don't know if you get in down the road as far as frequencies and stuff, but every color has a frequency. And I mean, even the color of the flower colors, that stuff affects us mentally. Each color has its own unique frequency. That's kind of weird stuff, but it's just amazing that, how when you see them, it does something for you. And anyhow, it's good for mental health. I love wildflowers. Get outside. What other habitat benefits do we get? Medicinal and herbal health. We talked about the hyssop, the yarrow. You guys have done a whole class on that. It's a lot of health benefits. Just got to observe the natural world like we were talking about with the monarchs here. And just observe God's beautiful creation. Get out and connect yourself with nature and your kids, when you create these habitats. And I know even at Syngenta, when we were first putting it in, once it's established, we're talking about putting trails through there. So, even the public, and we'll work with the FFA kids and bring them over, and so try to connect people with nature and make what we're doing that much better. But got to get kids involved. I've done this at my place. You saw some of the family pictures, but people can come out and do senior pictures, family pictures when you have the wildflower thing. Go through the next slide. Yeah, there's an example. Next, I teach survival at our local homeschool co-op, and we do a survival camp out on the property and just, include all of this stuff, the trees and the prairie and all the things that we talked about today. And so we do it overnight. And in our survival class next, there's way back in the day, just have most of these kids came from troubled homes, do a camp out there and just teach them about nature. Many of them, their first and some of them their only probably real hands-on experience in nature. Next, done a wedding out on our property, and now I'm creating a whole nother wedding venue, like massive scale. It's going to be so full of pollinator habitat. And I got 6 kids. I'm like, well, I might as well just make a nice wedding venue at home for them. So, next, that's it as far as my presentation. A lot of information out there. There's a lot we could talk about and didn't talk about. Specifically, we didn't get into a lot of detail about the common milkweed. That is such a beneficial plant for the monarch, and you definitely want it. But there's this balance to getting it established. But you got to have that if you're going to get into the pollinator habitat. You got to have the common milkweed. That's their number one food. Yeah, but that's just out in nature. That's a biennial thistle. Yep. And I let those go to do their flowering, and then the only reason they're there is because I'd worked up some ground, and so they popped up. Yes.
So I've been doing this monarch thing for several years now. I've probably reached like 1,800.
Wow.
So last spring I decided to try harvesting milkweed seed and try scattering it in such a large area. And I'm real curious to see if anything's going to come up this year. So I think I did this right. It's out in the woods, but a clear area.
Yep.
Power line.
Yep.
And so I scratched up the soil.
Yep.
It's almost gravelly. So
Yep.
it's not even real great.
Yep.
But scattered it, and I tried to kind of stomp on it a little bit.
Yep.
Is that enough, maybe?
That should be enough. What percentage you're going to get, I don't know, but that's the best you can do in that scenario. It's no different than what I do, really. You drop seed, and then I roll behind it with that cultipacker.
So do you think something's going to grow this year, but I might not get pods and blossoms this year?
Not likely. It's going to be mainly root establishment. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Maybe so much you realize you probably only needed to do 10 of them down the road, but no, it's good. Just might not have much diversity. Yes, sir.
Aside from the fruit and berry trees, pollinators like what other kinds? Like basswood?
Basswood, yeah, lindens, yeah. I guess you have big cherry trees like black cherry. So there's forested trees. Linden, elms even have flowering. Like a lot of, mainly we have Siberian elm around here now instead of the American elm, but elms and your basswoods. Even oaks flower, but they're not primary. So it's going to be beetles and stuff more than not your bees and monarchs as much. But yeah, so flowering shrubs, that's another important aspect of pollinator habitat. And incorporating that, like if it's a backyard, you have your pollinator, prairie, flower, herb garden, but then on the backside you can put aronia berry or black chokeberry, or you don't want to do American plum in a small setting because they form thickets, and so I put one in one time in a bad spot, and now it's everywhere. So you gotta be somewhat selective in what you're putting in. Chokecherry, similar, they form thickets, but there's definitely options for bushes that you can put in for pollinators as well. Yes, sir. You're talking to probably the right guy. 3 years ago, I drove from the high school to Dassel, and I looked along the rail line, and I looked at all these dead trees and ash. I'm like, it's here. And I go on the website, No record of it in Meeker County. Wait another year. I'm thinking, maybe it might just be something else. I knew it wasn't. More dying, more dead. Look on the website. No record of it in Meeker County. Wait another year. My buddy who's in this field with me works at the FSA NRCS office. I was on his property last year, and I'm thinking about getting a tree lift, because I do tree service as well. Because it's here. He's like, oh, it's here? I'm like, he's coming out, and I mean, he's a smart guy, but they don't even have knowledge of it in the office. So yeah, I've talked to people, I can go on Emerald Ash Borer. Just basically, if you have ash trees in your yard, I don't want to put my foot in my mouth, but I would basically write them off as dead. But, yeah, and if you know people that need to budget their ash trees because they can't afford to get them all out, start budgeting them out, because some people can't afford to get them out, let alone 10 of them. Yeah, and it's pretty easy to get into the bark and find it, but I can't believe it's not being. I've talked to people in the city council in Cokato. I'm like, this is a political issue, because you're dealing with they're going to start dying. People can't afford it. The neighbors are mad because their tree's going to fall on their house. And I'm like, you got to get ahead of this. Start telling people. Start letting them know that they got to make a game plan for them. But it's not even coming out of the EAB website. Didn't even have Meeker County on it yet. Is not having it? They have. Yeah, Wright County has it, but Meeker County, that rail line, it's just everything's dead or dying. Anyhow, another subject, but. There's a lot of good options, but you have oak wilt with oaks, and that's red oaks primarily. You have some of those new elms that they're putting in. You know, I can give you a lot of choices, but I'm trying to think of things that not to do. But I've been planting trees for every year, and so maples are usually good too. Not Norway maple. Norway's invasive. So if you want to get a good sugar maple, if you're in town, silver maples are nice, but I don't know why people would want to put them near their house. It's a softer maple. So maples are still a pretty good one. A little bit, not as much as walnuts. It's called alleliopathic. Like walnuts are alleliopathic. That basically puts a toxin and kills everything around it, so that it keeps its space for itself. But they're all over. People have them all over town here, and they don't trim them, and then they're 10 stem, and then they're leaning, and they grow so fast, and it's that they get so big. And because they're not usually pruned properly at a young age, they're usually an issue. And I've done enough tree work around town here that I see very few that I'm not a little leery about. Whereas the sugar maple's a hardwood. What's that? Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yep. Fragmented. Yeah. Yeah. So you're looking at. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah. So if you look at these bigger outfits that do what I do, like Prairie Restorations, Minnesota Native Landscapes, M&L, it's a concept of really connecting, creating this network, all through the city, even through Minneapolis, St. Paul, looking at it, and can we piece it all together? Just piecing the land together. It's not going to be perfect, but can you create these corridors, concept? So that's the way to do it. I mean, there's so many variables going against it. So, if you get a development and, you should have these areas. I mean, the name of my business is Maximized Habitats. The concept is, like this is just my property. I just turned it into a business. But every thing I'm not using my garden or my yard. I'm maximizing that habitat outside of my garden or yard, and I'm just right tree, right plant, right, and so I'm just creating this matrix where everything will be this. And so you can take that to a larger level and a community level, and you start looking at all the parks. Does Prairie Park even have a prairie in it? You live right there. Tanya, do you know? Do you have wildflowers in there? Are there any Are there flowers at Prairie Park? So let's get a hold of the city council and let's put a prairie at Prairie Park, so at least the name applies to it, for a reason. Those things. So you take the parks and you start making sure that this is going on in each park. That's a good way of piecing it all together, especially as a nonprofit type thing, or whatever, with your ability to. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. So yeah, just got to be creative. Oh, but then you start thinking about monarchs and their and how far they travel. It's mind blowing, the life of a monarch. It's absolutely mind blowing. And what we do there, they still got to make it 3,000 miles before they're back, and it's amazing. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about nesting habitat? I mean, this is like a lot of food.
Yeah. So this is the food aspect of bees. So, we can create the boxes, the wood boxes you can put up for some bees. And that's the thing. There's so many different bees that have different nesting habitats. One thing I did some research on was bumblebees. So bumblebees are generally in the ground. So the bumblebees use like an old mouse hole, or a snake hole. And so bumblebees require this, and some live in the stems of plants for overwintering. And they talk about wood piles. So it's just such a diverse, there's no like specific thing, because there's such a diverse amount of bees with different nesting and habitats. So it's about not having a manicured lawn. It's about, when I was looking at that, they talked about, how the farmers used to have all of the rows of trees and stuff in between fields. Now they just get rid of all of that. Well, that is where all these things would have their habitat to live in the roots of trees and whatever. And the problem on that scale is we're just going egg to egg. So what we can do, even on our yard setting, is have those areas that they can be organized, but you leave a brush pile or whatever, a little bit, where it can be minimal, but if you want it to look good, it can look good. Or you get the bee box, but there's just so many different styles. But even the stems of all of our garden, they say do not go right now until things get 50-some degrees, or for a while, because these things are still nesting inside of the stems of all of these plants. So it's about not getting rid of everything, basically. It's really it's nature. They find their spots. Is it full of stems? I guess it would be, do you have a lot of area nearby that they could be in? Yeah. I mean, you gotta pick your battles. It can't be perfect, or you get rid of that material right away when it's done and get it off site so that they're not going to nest in it. You gotta go? Or question? Thank you. You bet.